When we look at people who've achieved really amazing things, it's so easy to just say, oh, they were born gifted.
Or they just worked harder than everybody else.
Yeah.
Simple explanations.
Exactly. But what if the real story is, well, messier, more interesting, full of hidden advantages and weird turns?
That's precisely what we're digging into today.
We're doing a deep dive.
Yeah, based on Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, The Story of Success. And
Yeah.
it's not just, feel-good stories.
Right.
He's looking for the patterns, the hidden connections between people like the Beatles, Bill Gates, and others you probably haven't heard of.
So think of this as like the inside track on some big ideas. We're going to talk about how your birthday could actually matter.
Yeah.
Seriously.
And that whole 10,000-hour thing to become an expert.
Yeah, the 10,000-hour rule. And we'll question if being a genius, like super high IQ, automatically means success.
And maybe most importantly, we'll look at opportunity. Who gets the chances? And how does where you come from, your cultural background, shape everything?
We'll see how like random historical moments can give certain people a massive leg up.
Right. The goal here is just to unpack these ideas, make them clear, give you some aha moments, hopefully, without making your head spin.
Okay, let's jump in. First up, this idea that, well, when you were born makes a difference. Gladwell calls it the Matthew effect.
Yeah, the Matthew effect. It's basically like the saying, the rich get richer, but for opportunity. Early advantages tend to build on themselves.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, he uses this fantastic example from Canadian youth hockey leagues. They group kids by year, right? But the cutoff date is often January 1st.
Ah, okay. So if you're born January 2nd, you're in the same league as a kid born December 30th,
Exactly. And when you're, say, 9 or 10 years old, that's almost a full year's difference in age.
which means a big difference in size, coordination.
Huge difference. So the slightly older kids, the January, February, March babies, they tend to be a bit bigger, maybe faster.
So they stand out more.
They get noticed by the coaches more easily. They're more likely to get picked for the select teams, the travel teams.
And then they get better coaching, more practice time.
Right. It's this cycle. That small initial advantage, just being slightly older, it compounds. It snowballs into a much bigger opportunity gap. It's less about pure talent at age 9 and more about developmental maturity because of that cutoff date.
Wow. And there's data for this.
Oh, yeah. Gladwell looked at the rosters for elite junior hockey teams in Canada, like the top teenage players. Overwhelmingly, the players were born in the first few months of the year, January, February, March. Far fewer born later in the year. It's not even close to random.
Huh.
And he found similar patterns in other sports, too, like European soccer. He mentions the Czech national team, same thing, lots of early year birthdays.
It makes you wonder how many potentially great players just missed out because they were born in, like, October instead of February.
Exactly. They never got onto that initial fast track.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, outside of sports, maybe in school or starting a career, do people who are slightly older within a group sometimes get unseen advantages early on?
It's definitely possible. The way we evaluate potential early, maybe it accidentally favors maturity over raw talent sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the birthday thing. What about this 10,000-hour rule? That one's pretty famous.
Right, the 10,000-hour rule. The basic idea is that achieving true expertise, like world-class mastery, takes roughly 10,000 hours of deliberate practice.
Deliberate practice, so not just messing around.
No, exactly. It's focused. It's pushing yourself, working on weaknesses, getting feedback, intentional improvement.
And the classic example is the Beatles.
Perfect example. Before they were, the Beatles, they spent an incredible amount of time playing in Hamburg, Germany.
Right, those really rough clubs,
Yeah,
long
of course.
sets, night after night.
Seriously long. Between 1960 and 62, they went to Hamburg 5 times for extended gigs. On just their first trip, they played over 100 nights, often 5, 6, 7 hours a night. By the time Beatlemania hit in 64, estimates are they'd performed live something like 1,200 times.
That's insane.
John Lennon even said they couldn't help but get better playing that much. They had to figure out how to entertain drunk Germans for hours. That sheer volume of time on stage was critical.
So it wasn't just magic. It was relentless practice in a demanding environment.
Absolutely. They honed their skills, their stage presence, everything through just sheer repetition and performance.
Okay, so that's music. What about tech? Bill Gates.
Another great example. Gates had this incredibly rare early access to computers. Back in 1968, when he was in 8th grade.
8th grade.
Yeah. His private school, Lakeside, had a time-sharing computer terminal. This was practically science fiction for most people back then.
So he could just use it.
Pretty much. He and Paul Allen, they basically lived in the computer room. When the school's initial money ran out, the parents chipped in more. They got access to university computers, worked on real programming projects for companies.
So he wasn't just playing games.
No, he was debugging code, learning systems inside out. By the time he dropped out of Harvard, he'd already logged way, way more than his 10,000 hours of programming. A massive head start.
And it wasn't just him, right? There was another guy.
Bill Joy? Yeah. Co-founder of Sun Microsystems. He had similar, almost unbelievable access to extensive programming time at the University of Michigan around the same period. It was one of the few places on Earth a young person could get that kind of immersion.
So the rule isn't just work hard for 10,000 hours. It's having the chance to do that often really early on.
Exactly. The opportunity has to be there, which really makes you think, what does it take in your field or something you're passionate about to get that kind of practice?
Yeah, and what resources or situations make that kind of deep dive even possible? It's not just willpower.
Right. And this connects to another fascinating bit in the book, The Trouble with Geniuses. It challenges our whole idea of what intelligence means for success.
Okay, how so?
Gladwell introduces Christopher Langan. This guy reportedly has an IQ off the charts, like near 200. Exceptionally brilliant.
So you'd think Nobel Prize winner, CEO, something huge, right?
That's the conventional thinking. But Langan's life hasn't followed that path. He's worked various jobs like construction, being a bouncer. He developed his own complex theories about the universe, but largely outside the usual academic world.
So genius-level IQ didn't equal world-changing success.
Not in the traditional sense. And it makes you question that direct link. Gladwell contrasts him with Lewis Terman's big study of gifted kids back in the day, the termites.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. Terman thought he could basically pick out future leaders just based on high IQ scores in childhood.
Exactly. And while his termites did tend to do pretty well in life, many had successful careers.
Yeah.
But the correlation wasn't perfect. Terman himself admitted later that IQ wasn't the sole predictor of massive achievement. Some termites with super high IQs had fairly average lives.
And didn't he miss some big names?
He did. Two future Nobel Prize winners in physics, William Shockley and Luis Alvarez, were actually tested for a study but rejected because their IQ scores weren't quite high enough.
Wow. So IQ isn't everything. What else is there?
Well, Gladwell talks about different kinds of thinking. There's convergent thinking, finding the single right answer, which is what IQ tests mostly measure.
Okay.
But then there's divergent thinking. That's more about creativity. How many different uses can you think of for a brick?
Ah, right. Build a wall, paperweight, doorstop, break a window.
Exactly. Generating lots of possibilities. That creative, flexible thinking is often crucial for real-world problem solving and innovation, maybe more so than just raw IQ points beyond a certain threshold.
So you need to be smart enough, but other skills become more important after that.
That seems to be the idea. He mentions a study at University of Michigan Law School where minority students who might have had lower LSAT scores coming in performed just as well as their peers by the end.
Because being a good lawyer takes more than test smarts.
Right. Practical intelligence, communication, navigating social situations, arguing persuasively, skills beyond pure IQ.
Okay, so it's not just raw intellect, which brings us back to opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And maybe something called cultural capital.
Exactly. This is where the contrast between Christopher Langan and Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project, becomes really stark.
Both brilliant guys.
Undeniably. But vastly different upbringings. Langan, as we said, grew up with a lot of poverty, instability, moving around.
Right. And he seemed to have trouble dealing with authority or institutions.
Yeah, Gladwell recounts stories where Langan struggled to navigate simple bureaucratic hurdles at college financial aid forms, class schedules. He clashed with professors, felt alienated, and ultimately dropped out multiple times. It seems like he didn't have the know-how to make the system work for him.
Okay, now Oppenheimer.
Completely different world. Grew up in a wealthy, highly educated family in New York City. His parents actively nurtured his talents, what sociologist Annette Lareau calls concerted cultivation.
Concerted cultivation.
Yeah.
What's that?
It's a style of parenting often seen in middle and upper middle class families. Parents actively manage their kids' lives, schedule activities, encourage them to question adults, negotiate, express their opinions. They treat them almost like mini projects to be developed,
ISIS.
versus what Leroux calls the accomplishment of natural growth, more common in working class or poorer families. Parents provide love and care, but children have more unstructured time, more autonomy, and learn to navigate the world more independently. They're often more deferential to authority figures.
In Oppenheimer's background gave him, what, a sense of entitlement.
A sense of entitlement, definitely, but also practical social skills. He knew how to talk to people in positions of power, how to argue his case, how to navigate complex social situations. There's this famous story where he actually tried to poison his tutor at Cambridge.
What? And he got away with it?
Well, he didn't succeed in poisoning him, but he managed to talk his way out of being expelled, ending up with just probation. He had the social dexterity, the confidence to handle a situation that might have completely derailed someone like Langan.
That's incredible. That ability to navigate the world. That's cultural capital.
That's a big part of it. It's the implicit knowledge, the skills, the confidence you absorb from your environment that helps you succeed within institutions and social structures.
So Langan had the raw brain power, but Oppenheimer had the brain power plus the cultural toolkit to use it effectively in the world.
That's a good way to put it. And this idea of opportunity being tied to specific circumstances extends beyond just family background. Gladwell tells this amazing story about Jewish lawyers in New York City.
Oh yeah, Joe Flom and those guys.
Exactly. Joe Flom, son of immigrants, brilliant guy, Harvard law grad. But in the mid-20th century, the big established white shoe law firms in New York, and they were very particular, mostly hired Protestant guys from the right families.
And they didn't want to touch certain kinds of law.
Right. They did the dignified corporate work taxes, regulations. They looked down their noses at litigation, lawsuits, and especially hostile corporate takeovers. That was considered like bare-knuckle brawling, not gentlemanly law.
So Flom and others like him who couldn't get into those top firms.
They ended up starting their own firms or joining less prestigious ones. And guess what kind of work they took on?
The stuff the white shoe firms wouldn't touch, litigation and takeovers.
Precisely. And then, starting in the 70s and 80s, hostile takeovers and corporate litigation just exploded. These lawyers suddenly found themselves with deep expertise in the hottest, most lucrative areas of law.
Wow, right place, right time, doing the wrong kind of work that became the right kind.
Exactly. And there was another factor, demographics. Flom and many of his peers were born during the Great Depression in the 1930s.
Okay, why does that matter?
Lower birth rates during the Depression meant their generation, their cohort, was relatively small. Less competition for spots in good schools, less competition getting started in their careers compared to people born just before or after them.
So a demographic sweet spot plus a shift in the legal market created this massive opportunity.
A unique window. Firms like Skadden, Arps Flom's firm, became dominant players, and Herbert Wachtell, founder of Wachtell Lipton, another incredibly successful firm, had a similar background and trajectory. They benefited from timing and circumstance.
It wasn't just being smart lawyers.
Being smart was necessary but not sufficient. They needed that specific historical moment. And Gladwell draws a parallel to earlier Jewish immigrants, like those in the New York garment industry.
Like Louis Bourgamick.
Yeah, people like the Borganics. They came over often with skills like tailoring. The garment trade was tough, long hours, but it offered three crucial things, Gladwell says, make work satisfying.
What are those?
Autonomy, they were often their own bosses. Complexity, the work required skill and thinking. And a clear connection between effort and reward. The harder they worked, the more they could potentially earn.
Unlike, say, being a peasant farmer where your whole crop could be wiped out by weather.
Right. This meaningful work, even though it was hard, allowed them to build businesses, gain economic footing, and pass advantages, financial and cultural, onto their children, who then went into professions like law.
It all connects. The skills, the work ethic, the timing.
It's a web of advantages, which leads perfectly into the idea of cultural legacies, how deep-seated cultural patterns influence behavior, sometimes over centuries.
Okay, like the example of Harlan, Kentucky.
Exactly. Harlan County in Appalachia. Gladwell explores the culture of honor that took root there among the early settlers, many of whom were Scotch-Irish.
A culture of honor, meaning what? Reputation is everything.
Pretty much. In the rough, lawless conditions of the borderlands they came from, and later in Appalachia, you had to fiercely defend your reputation, your family, your property, yourself. Insults couldn't be ignored. Disputes were often settled violently.
The famous Appalachian feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, or the ones in Harlan.
Yeah, the Turner-Howard feud in Harlan is a prime example. These things could go on for generations, fueled by this deep cultural script about honor and retaliation. Even minor slights could escalate incredibly quickly.
And does that linger,
Yeah.
even today?
Apparently, yes. Gladwell cites research by psychologists Cohen and Nisbet, who did experiments comparing northern and southern U.S. college students.
What did they find?
They'd subtly insult the students. The Southerners reacted much more strongly physiologically, hormonally, and in their subsequent behavior. They were much more likely to perceive their masculinity as being challenged and to respond aggressively.
Wow, so that cultural legacy, that sensitivity to insult, it's still measurable hundreds of years later.
It seems so. It shows how powerful these inherited cultural patterns can be, even when the original reasons for them are long gone.
Okay, so that's a culture with maybe some negative modern consequences. What about cultural legacies that affect things like plane crashes?
Ah, yes, the ethnic theory of plane crashes. This is one of the most controversial but fascinating parts of the book. He focuses on Korean Air.
They had a really bad safety record for a while, didn't they?
Terrible, yes. Gladwell argues it wasn't faulty planes or poorly trained pilots in the technical sense. It was partly due to Korean culture's high power distance index, or PDI.
Power distance, meaning how much people accept hierarchy.
Exactly. High PDI cultures have a strong deference to authority. In the cockpit, this meant junior officers, first officers, flight engineers were often extremely reluctant to directly challenge the captain, even if they saw something wrong.
They wouldn't just say, "Hey, Captain, I think you're making a mistake."
Often no. They'd use what linguists call mitigated speech. They'd hint, suggest, downplay the warning, rather than stating the problem clearly and forcefully. Captain, the weather radar doesn't look good, instead of, sir, we need to divert immediately.
And in an emergency, those few seconds of indirectness.
Can be catastrophic. Gladwell analyzes transcripts from crashes like Korean Air Flight 801 in Guam and the Avianca crash near New York, showing how this mitigated speed contributed to disaster. Junior crew members saw the problems but failed to communicate the urgency effectively across that power distance gap.
So Korean Air had to change their culture.
Fundamentally, they brought in outsiders, changed procedures, even mandated that English be used in the cockpit to try and flatten that hierarchy a bit, as English allows for slightly more direct communication than formal Korean might in that context, and their safety record improved dramatically.
That's incredible. Culture directly impacting safety protocols.
Yeah. And then he flips it to look at a potential cultural advantage, the supposed Asian advantage in math.
Right. Why do students from some East Asian cultures often excel at math? Is it just that they're naturally better?
Gladwell argues no, it's not innate ability. He suggests it's partly rooted in, believe it or not, rice farming.
Rice farming.
Traditional wet rice paddy agriculture, common in southern China for centuries, is incredibly precise, complex, and labor-intensive work. It requires cooperation, planning, and relentless effort year-round. Crucially, the link between effort and reward is very direct. The harder and smarter you work on your paddy, the more rice you harvest.
Okay. So it fosters a culture of persistence.
Exactly. Persistence, meticulousness, a belief that hard work pays off. These are the exact same virtues needed to succeed in mathematics, which often requires wrestling with difficult problems for a long time. He contrasts this with, say, medieval European peasant farming, which was much more dependent on weather and less consistently demanding.
So a cultural inheritance of valuing hard, meticulous work translates well to math class.
That's the theory. Plus, there's a potential linguistic advantage.
How so?
Many Asian number systems are more regular and logical than English. 11, 12, 13 are weird. In Chinese, Japanese, Korean, it's basically 10-1, 10-2, 10-3. Much simpler, makes counting and basic arithmetic potentially more intuitive early on.
Huh. Interesting. So culture, language, work ethic, it all feeds in.
Right. And he uses the example of KPP academy schools in places like the South Bronx.
What do they do?
They serve mostly disadvantaged kids, but they get amazing results, especially in math, and a key part of their model. Way more time spent learning, longer school days, shorter summer breaks, Saturday classes. They basically instill that same culture of persistent hard work that Gladwell links to rice paddies.
They make up for environmental disadvantages with sheer time on task. He includes that schedule of a KPP student, Marita, right? It's exhausting just reading it.
It is. It drives home the level of commitment. And he points out how the long American summer vacation actually widens the achievement gap. Wealthier kids keep learning or have enriching experiences, while poorer kids often experience summer slide, forgetting what they learned.
So again, it's about opportunity and the cultural value placed on sustained effort.
Exactly. These cultural legacies, good and bad, shape opportunity in profound ways.
Which brings us to the end, where he tells his own family's story, his mother's journey from Jamaica.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to tie everything together. He shows how his mother, Joyce, and her twin sister were able to get scholarships and pursue higher education in Jamaica, something almost unthinkable for Black women in the American South at that time.
Why was Jamaica different?
Several factors. Historical events like the Jamaica riots of 1937 opened up some educational opportunities, but also Jamaica had a different, more complex racial hierarchy than the U.S. binary system. There was a significant colored or mixed race middle class, descendants of unions between white plantation owners and Black slaves.
And they had more opportunity.
Relatively speaking, yes. They occupied this middle stratum and faced fewer absolute barriers than Black people in the Jim Crow South. Gladwell's maternal grandmother, Daisy Nation, came from this background and was fiercely ambitious for her daughter's education. She saw a path for them within that specific Jamaican social structure.
So historical timing, social structure, and individual drive all came together.
Exactly. It wasn't just one thing. It was the confluence of all these factors. The legacy of Jamaican history, the specific social niche her family occupied, and her grandmother's determination that created the opportunity for his mother's success.
It really drives home the main point, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That extraordinary success is almost never just about one person's talent or effort in isolation.
It's about timing,
Being in the right place at the right time,
having those unique chances,
the cultural background you inherit.
and how all these little advantages, some earned, some just lucky, add up over time.
Right. Understanding these hidden currents gives you a much, much richer way to think about why some people succeed and others don't. It's more complex, maybe less satisfying than simple hero worship, but probably closer to the truth.
So the final thought, maybe, is to look at the success stories we admire, even our own lives, and ask, what was the web of advantages? What were the lucky breaks, the historical circumstances, the cultural inheritances that played a role?
Yeah. And maybe, just maybe, if we understand those factors better, we can think about how to spread those gifts of history and opportunity around more widely. How can we create systems where more people get the chances that Gladwell shows were so crucial for his outliers?
Something to definitely think about.